Hello again. Welcome everybody. Dr. Jordan Taylor, Undergraduate Exercise Science Program Director and Associate Teaching Professor here at the University of Kansas. So on today's episode of Fitness Facts, I'm going to be talking about factors affecting muscle growth and how much muscle you can expect to build over your lifetime. So a quick overview so you kind of get an idea where we're going here. First off, I'm going to talk about factors that affect muscle growth and then divide that out into genetics, muscle fiber types, skeletal structure, hormones, resistance training, nutrition, rest, recovery, and sleep, how age affects muscle growth, sex, and then also your resistance training status. So a lot of things to discuss. That's part of where we're going. And then if we go to the next slide here, I also want to talk about how much muscle can you expect to build in one day, which is a very small amount, in 1 year, beyond 1 year, and then over the course of your lifetime. All right, so first let's talk about genetics. And I have quite a few slides here on this. We all know, intuitively, genetics do play a role in muscle growth. Some people tend to put on muscle more easily than others. So let's kind of talk about, why that is. Genetics obviously influence muscle composition, fiber type distribution. So you may have heard that some individuals have more like type 2 fast twitch muscle fibers, and these tend to be larger fibers that are capable of producing more force. Other people may have a greater percentage of type 1 slow twitch muscle fibers. These, if you have a lot of these, you may be really good at like endurance events, cross country, running marathons. They tend to be smaller fibers, but they're very good at utilizing oxygen to burn carbs and fats to produce fuel for muscle contraction. So they're very fatigue resistant, but they're smaller fibers, don't produce a lot of force. So you can see how maybe your fiber type plays a role in muscle fiber size and maybe what sports you may be more apt to participate in. So we'll talk more about that in a bit. And then also how genetics influence the responsiveness to training stimuli, such as resistance training. So if you can remember from maybe middle school biology class when you're learning about genes, and remember that genes are located on the DNA within the nucleus of a cell. And we have about 25,000, maybe a little more genes in the human genome. And many of these genes provide a code so that your cells can translate proteins, right? So just like you may have, maybe if you have your favorite recipe book, or you've got a recipe online, and obviously there's a list of steps that you would read and follow. That's your code to make whatever recipe. Your cells kind of have this recipe or instruction manual as well, and that's just your genes. So specific genes within the nucleus of your cells, many of them code for proteins, and some of these proteins may be involved in muscle contraction, like proteins like actin and myosin that get produced. And obviously, there's other genes that code for proteins that are involved in growth and repair of the cells as well. Muscle fiber type and quantity are determined by genetics, which that can affect strength and endurance. Like I said, we're going to get into talking about the two common fiber types that you hear about, and some differences in those, the characteristics between the different fiber types. And then, like I said, some people just naturally build muscle more easily due to differences in fiber type and other genetic factors. So the first gene I want to talk about here is the ACTN3 gene. All right, and so this gene is commonly referred to as the sports gene. And the purpose of this gene is it provides a code to produce the alpha-actinin 3 protein. Okay, so this ACTN3 gene gets transcribed or copied. A little copy of the genetic code called a messenger RNA molecule gets sent out from the nucleus to the cell, and it's going to pass through ribosomes that are out in the cytoplasm. And ribosomes, their whole main responsibility is to translate and produce a protein based off of that code that's coming from the gene, in this case, the ACTN3 gene. So when the ribosome receives that code that's on the mRNA molecule, amino acids are going to be transferred in to the ribosome. Those amino acids are going to be linked together through peptide bonds, and you'll produce a specific protein. In this case, the ACTN3 gene provides the instructions or the code to produce the alpha-actinin 3 protein, all right? And what's interesting is this protein, alpha-actinin 3, is found only in type 2 fast-twitch muscle fibers. And as I mentioned before, these are the fibers that tend to be larger. They can produce more force. However, they do fatigue pretty easily. But, you know, somebody that's really strong, just naturally, like maybe throughout life, like maybe they don't even do much resistance training, but then they start lifting. It's like, man, they get strong, they get big fast. Well, maybe they have a greater percentage of these. So some people, about 20% of the population, have a genetic change. And what I mean by genetic change, you may have seen this term before. It's a polymorphism, so that's a change in the genetic code there. And in the ACTN3 gene, that causes them not to produce the alpha-actinin 3 protein found in type 2 fast-twitch muscle fibers. So if you follow me here, again, the genetic code is really just a bunch of A's, T's, G's, and C's, which are nucleotides, adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. Those A's, T's, C's, and genes, the different order that they're in is going to allow for those ribosomes to translate proteins. And if there's a change in maybe one of those letters, we'd call that a single nucleotide polymorphism, that could impair what protein gets produced, right? So in this case, if there maybe is a change in that genetic code on the ACTN3 gene, then in about 20% of the population, the ribosomes would not be able to produce that alpha-actinin 3 protein in those fast-twitch fibers because the code coming from the gene isn't correct. It's like the instruction manual has been changed or the recipe has been changed. The code isn't correct, okay? So now let's talk about alleles, okay? So an allele, you see there R allele of the ACTN3 gene or the X allele of the ACTN3 gene. An allele is just a variant due to a mutation or polymorphism in a specific gene. So although we all have like the same genes in the human genome, there are variants or variations of these genes, okay? So we call these alleles. So an individual that has the R allele of the ACTN3 gene encodes the functioning alpha-actinin 3 protein. But individuals that have the X allele, the X variant of this ACTN3 gene, they don't produce the alpha-actinin 3 protein, and that then is associated with a lower percentage of those type 2 fast-twitch muscle fibers, so they have less of them, okay? And so we'll get into the implications, how this affects, you know, muscle growth and force production, power, things like that, okay? So this slide kind of shows that. So we're looking again at different ACTN3 genotypes and the effect of these different genotypes, whether you have the R allele or the X type, on your exercise, recovery, and injury. So if we look at that first column there under exercise, individuals with the R allele, they tend to respond better to resistance training. So better muscle growth, you know, or strength, power production, etc., than individuals that have the X genotype or the X allele, the X variant, okay? So they have a less or lessened response to resistance training, all right? Now, if we look at recovery, right, because think about it, a lot of people think muscles grow like when you're lifting. You know, sometimes you may feel a muscle pump because there's increased blood flow going to the muscle, and the muscles feel larger and tight. But muscles actually grow during recovery in between your resistance training sessions, right? So even though they may feel bigger and kind of pumped up when you're lifting weights, that's not actually when they're growing, right? They're growing in the recovery period, okay? For 24 to 48 hours after a resistance training session, that's really when muscle protein synthesis is increased and your body's trying to lay down and build new muscle proteins so that those fibers grow larger. So during the recovery phase between workouts, if you have the R allele of the ACTN3 gene, and there's going to be 2 copies of this gene, you're going to have less muscle damage from working out, and specifically eccentric training. So eccentric training is the phase of a lift where you're like lowering a load and resisting the load against gravity. So like on a bench press, it'd be when you're lowering the load down, the chest, the anterior deltoids, the triceps are going to be lengthening under tension to resist and decelerate that load. So they're contracting, but they're stretching out. And that's when you can get some little micro trauma, micro tears in the fibers, and obviously that has to be repaired. So those with the R allele, they tend to repair, they have less muscle damage following that type of training. And then if you have the X allele or genotype, there's more muscle damage from eccentric training. So if we look at injury, the R allele, having that, there's a lower risk of muscular injuries. And then the X version, XX, you have a higher injury risk. And this article, peer-reviewed journal article here from back in 2003 that was published by Yang and colleagues. The title of it is "The ACTN3 Genotype is Associated with Human Elite Athletic Performance." So again, wanting to look at genetics here, and this wasn't so much looking specifically at muscle growth, but they were looking at Olympic athletes versus elite endurance athletes, all right? And so what they noted here in this study is that all male Olympic power athletes in this study carried at least one copy of the ACTN3 gene R allele. And again, by having at least one copy of that was associated with the presence of alpha-actinin 3 protein in those type 2 fast-twitch muscle fibers. And again, that protein is only found in type 2. And some individuals had 2 copies of this ACTN3 gene R allele, which even likely is going to enhance performance even more in power, sprint, any activities that requires a lot of force production. Elite endurance athletes had a slightly higher frequency, so 24% of the XX genotype, which is associated with alpha-3 actinin protein deficiency, than did control. So again, these elite endurance athletes, because of the variant that they had of this ACTN3 gene, they have a deficiency in producing that alpha-actinin 3 protein. And so that plays a role, probably, it could. Training also plays a role. It's not just genetics, but this plays a role in why they may have become an elite endurance athlete versus a power athlete. So this is an interesting picture here, a slide. So I want to talk about the myostatin gene. So you see the MSTN gene. So myostatin is interesting. The myostatin gene provides a code to produce the myostatin protein. And the myostatin protein, what it does in your skeletal muscle cells is it inhibits how much muscle you can grow, all right? Because although, if you were a bodybuilder or maybe an athlete involved in, like, say, powerlifting or some sport where you need to be really strong and have some muscle mass, you would think, oh, man, I want, like, unlimited muscle growth. But that actually is not the healthiest thing for your body, and we need to have some checks and balances there so we don't just get uncontrolled muscle growth, right? We don't want to have too much. So myostatin is this protein, again, that inhibits or limits how much muscle a person can build, all right? Now, there can be variations in this gene and mutations that occur, and that can lead to increased or decreased production of functional myostatin protein, which obviously can affect muscle mass and strength. So think about it. If you had a mutation where the gene is producing more myostatin protein, you're going to have more or greater inhibition of muscle growth, right? Because that's what myostatin does, is limits the amount of muscle tissue you can grow. Now, if you have a mutation in the gene where you're not producing any functional myostatin protein, then you're going to get excessive muscle growth because there's basically no way to inhibit it, okay? And so on the right-hand side there, you see this double-muscled Belgian blue cow. So these Belgian blue cows have a mutation in the myostatin gene where this causes a deficiency in the myostatin protein production. So because they produce deficient myostatin protein, it's not a functional protein, they can't they have no inhibition of muscle growth. So they have many, many more muscle fibers than, say, if they didn't have this mutation. So they have many more muscle fibers. Not only do they have more muscle fibers, but they grow more muscle mass because they can more easily convert the feed they eat into muscle tissue. And they just have basically kind of uncontrolled muscle growth, all right? So just very interesting, again, how genetics and variations here can affect ultimately how much muscle you grow. And you see this in not only Belgian blue cows. If you look up, there's a type of dog called a whippet. Look up whippets, you'll see examples of this. They've done studies in mice where they knock out the myostatin gene, so they delete it or they downregulate it so it produces less myostatin protein or none at all. And you see these huge, like, Schwarzenegger mice that have all kinds of crazy muscle growth and muscle mass. So again, kind of interesting here with the myostatin gene and the genetics at play with it. In humans, there's been studies where they've looked at humans. Even some children have been born with a downregulated or no myostatin gene, and you'll see accelerated muscle growth, more muscle fibers in kids. Here's an example of Flex Wheeler. He's a former bodybuilder, professional bodybuilder, IFBB pro, that he was believed to have had a myostatin gene mutation based on a study done by Balco Laboratories. So he was one of 9 bodybuilders identified in this study who had a myostatin deficiency, right? So wasn't producing functional myostatin protein due to genetic variation in that myostatin gene. So again, naturally, you tend to, see more muscle fibers, more muscle growth because of that mutation. So along with his consistent training, diet, and yes, he did use anabolic steroids, and he's openly admitted that. That combination of the genetics, the variation in this gene, the diet, high calorie diet, high protein intake, and the use of anabolic steroids, which obviously is going to enhance muscle growth, that allowed him to build an exceptional amount of muscle. So the next gene to talk about is the IGF-1 gene. So IGF-1 produces a hormone called insulin-like growth factor. And insulin-like growth factor plays a key role in muscle repair and growth. So again, the gene's going to produce this hormone. This hormone will be released into the blood. And you can see there on the right side, it has many, many effects in muscle tissue. But that hormone is going to look for the IGF-1 receptor that's on skeletal muscle cells. As I mentioned, it plays a key role in signaling pathways inside the cell to increase muscle protein synthesis, satellite cell proliferation, which we'll talk about, to decrease proteolysis, which is protein breakdown in the cell. So if you have a decrease in protein breakdown and you have an increase in protein synthesis, that's going to help muscle fibers grow, or muscle cells grow larger, and it's going to allow for muscle to hypertrophy or grow in size. So again, IGF-1, big role in muscle repair, growth, and especially after resistance training workouts. Variations in the gene can affect the rate at which muscles recover and grow after exercise. So this slide shows basically these two molecules that I talked about. So the myostatin protein and then insulin-like growth factor 1, and how they affect what are called signaling pathways inside skeletal muscle. So if you look at kind of that red membrane, that's the sarcolemma, or the cell membrane, the plasma membrane of a muscle fiber. So that's just kind of the outside of the cell. Then down deeper in the cell, you see the cytoplasm, where a lot of those like gray and red and blue abbreviations, those kind of rectangles and circles are, that's out in the cell cytoplasm. And then further down you have the nucleus, which contains our various genes. Okay, so if we look at kind of where you see there's a green and blue receptor there for myostatin. Remember what I said myostatin does is it's going to inhibit muscle growth, from you developing too much muscle mass. So if myostatin protein binds to that green and blue receptor, it switches on these signaling pathways in the cell. And so if you follow those red arrows down, you see that SMAD2 and SMAD3, and then that SMAD2 and SMAD3 has a little orange P attached to it, which means that protein has become phosphorylated. So there's this cascade or this chain of events that happens inside the muscle cell when myostatin binds to its receptor, and it's signaling through these SMAD proteins ultimately to the nucleus of the cell. You see that little red kind of T-bar that's there below at SMAD4. So that T-bar is inhibiting genes involved in, muscle differentiation, muscle growth. It's blocking that from occurring. And then if you follow kind of the red dashed T-bar line that's coming from that receptor, so myostatin also affects another pathway in the cell. So myostatin binds to the receptor. It blocks that PI3K, so that's an enzyme over on the right side. And what that enzyme normally does is causes this AKT enzyme to be phosphorylated, so there's a little P on the AKT. But if that PI3K enzyme is inhibited because myostatin binds to its receptor, then you'll see there's a FOXO1 protein there. That's called a transcription factor. That moves from the cytoplasm into the nucleus of the cell. When myostatin binds to its receptor, the FOXO1 transcription factor is going to move from the cytoplasm into the nucleus of the cell, bind to a promoter region of DNA, and it's going to cause the transcription of, if you look in the nucleus, you'll see MRF1 and atrogen1. When FOXO1 moves into the nucleus, it's going to cause those genes to get copied and transcribed. Those genes meaning MRF1 and atrogen1. A copy of MRF1 and atrogen1, an mRNA copy, moves from the nucleus out to the cytoplasm, which this isn't shown. And that copy of those two genes, MRF1 and atrogen1, is going to get translated into proteins or enzymes in this case. MRF1 protein, atrogen1 protein. These enzymes that get translated are called E3 ligases. And what these ligases do is they increase protein breakdown in the cell. Okay? So if we follow this, I'll go through it again quickly. Myostatin binds to the receptor, inhibits, that's that dashed red T-bar line, PI3K from causing AKT to be phosphorylated. If AKT remains not phosphorylated, the FOXO1 transcription factor can move, follow that red arrow into the nucleus. The FOXO1 transcription factor causes the MRF1 and atrogen1 genes to be copied or transcribed, and then the copy, the mRNA copy of the MRF1 and atrogen1 genes goes back out to the cytoplasm, gets fed through ribosomes, and those ribosomes create the enzymes that are called E3 ligases. So that's the MRF1 and atrogen1 enzymes that are produced from those genes. And those E3 ligase enzymes that are produced are involved in degrading proteins and breaking down proteins. And so you have, if you think about it, if your muscles are atrophying, they're shrinking maybe due to illness or bed rest, or maybe you haven't been working out in a while, that pathway may be upregulated where you're going to have more protein breakdown in your muscle cells than you have protein synthesis or building. And anytime your muscle cells are breaking down more protein than they're building, you're going to have atrophy, you're going to have a shrinking of the cells, you're going to have a loss of muscle size, okay? And so, again, that myostatin protein binding to its receptor is really, it can inhibit muscle growth by inhibiting genes in the nucleus, and it can cause certain enzymes to be produced that literally are involved in degrading or breaking down protein in muscle fibers. And again, muscle is 70% water and about 20 to 25% protein. So if you're breaking down and degrading more protein, you're going to have a net more protein degradation than synthesis. You're going to have a net loss of muscle mass, okay? And then if we look at IGF-1, you can see on the right-hand side of that plasma membrane, the cell membrane of the muscle, you have that IGF-1 hormone binding to the receptor. And what it normally does, it's going to work the opposite of myostatin, right? So IGF-1, when it binds to the receptor and you follow those black arrows down, it activates that PI3K enzyme. PI3 is a kinase, which means it causes phosphorylation of another molecule. In this case, AKT gets phosphorylated. You see the little orange P there. When AKT is phosphorylated, that activates another molecule called mTOR. And mTOR is responsible for ultimately, if you follow the arrows down, activating an enzyme called P70S6K. That's a kinase enzyme. When that P70S6K is activated downstream of mTOR, that's going to cause the ribosomes to increase protein synthesis. And so in this case, you increase protein synthesis. That's working the opposite of protein degradation or breakdown. You have more protein synthesis occurring, less degradation. You're going to produce more contractile proteins in muscle. If you produce more proteins inside muscle, those cells are going to be larger. That's hypertrophy. Anytime the cells increase in size, that's going to be, in this case, due to more protein getting packed in each cell. And if that's happening in each cell in a muscle, then the whole muscle itself would grow larger. Okay, so again, these myostatin and IGF-1, they kind of work opposite of each other, right? Myostatin is inhibiting muscle growth, turning off pathways that lead to muscle protein synthesis. IGF-1 is working the opposite. IGF-1 is going to activate signaling pathways inside muscle that ultimately increase protein synthesis and lead to muscle growth, okay? All right, so genetic responses to resistance exercise in human skeletal muscle are highly variable, right? And you may have heard this. Some individuals may be like high responders to resistance training, others low responders. Anyone, it doesn't matter your genetics. I don't want you to think, oh, just because you may think, oh, I don't have a lot of type 2 fast twitch muscle fibers, I don't produce much alpha-actinin 3 protein, I shouldn't do any resistance training, I won't get any muscle growth because of my genetics. That's not true. You may get less than somebody that has a lot of type 2 fast twitch muscle fibers and a lot of that alpha-actinin protein produced, alpha-actinin 3. But anyone, regardless of your genetics, you can get stronger and build muscle, okay? Some people just tend to build more than others, and we would call those high responders to training. They just may have a genetic makeup that allows them to, because maybe they do have more alpha-actinin 3 protein and more fast twitch fibers, and maybe they produce less myostatin, and maybe they have higher levels of IGF-1 that would lead to more muscle protein synthesis, right? Or other hormones like testosterone. And so there's a lot of variables here. Genetics are a factor, but I don't want you to think, oh, I don't have the genetics to develop muscle or get stronger, because everyone will respond to resistance training if you do it consistently over time, okay? So some people's genes make them more responsive to the benefits of resistance exercise, leading to greater muscle growth. A 2016 study by Amitov and colleagues focused on the genetic aspects of sports performance, health, and physique. And in this study, they found that 155 different genes are associated with physical performance and body composition. So there's a lot of different genes here, probably more than that. That's just this study, what was identified. But again, remember, there can be different variants of these genes, right, between individuals. Okay, and so this study suggests that our genetic makeup plays a significant role in how our bodies respond to exercise and muscle building. And this is just one study. I mean, there's constantly studies coming out as we do more research into cellular, molecular biology, and genetic study of muscle growth. So here in this study, and this was the same one that I just mentioned on the previous slide by Amitov and colleagues, looking at genes and athletic performance. In the past 19 years, if you read in the abstract that I have highlighted there, at least 155 genetic markers located within almost all chromosomes and mitochondrial DNA were found to be linked to elite athletic status, and 93 endurance-related genetic markers and 62 power and strength-related genetic markers. So just here's some interesting statistics. to kind of hammer this home about genetics, I know I've spent a lot of time talking about it, but approximately 50 to 60% of muscle mass is determined by genetics. Genetic factors account for 25 to 30% of the variance in muscle strength. Around 2 to 5% of the population has the genetic potential to become elite strength athletes, so small percentage. Everyone can't be an Olympian. Individuals with a specific variant of the myostatin gene have twice the average muscle mass. If you think back to that slide that I showed Flex Wheeler on. Obviously, genetics aren't the only component there. I mean, there's a lot of years of training and diet and other factors as well. Genetic factors can influence the rate of muscle protein synthesis, which can vary by up to 50% among individuals. Like I said, if you're an individual that maybe had a mutation in the myostatin gene, or you produce less myostatin protein, but you had high anabolic hormone levels like IGF-1 and testosterone and insulin and growth hormone, you may have a greater rate of protein synthesis than somebody else. And you'd have also at the same time less protein degradation and less inhibition of muscle growth due to the myostatin being downregulated. Okay, so again, variations among people. Individuals with 2 copies of the R variant of the ACTN3 gene are overrepresented among elite power athletes. Remember, like I said, they tend to respond better to resistance training if they have that double R genotype. Better gains with resistance training, more strength, better recovery, less likely to suffer from muscular injury because of that variant of that allele of the ACTN3 gene. So genetics play a role in muscle growth. Obviously, that's true, as I've hammered home here, but other factors such as diet, exercise, sleep, and just overall health are also very important, critical factors, all right? So there's many other factors here involved that we're going to get into. Before getting into some of those other factors, let's talk about muscle fiber types. I've mentioned some of this. If you look at the average person walking the street, most people are going to have about 50% type 1, which are known as slow twitch muscle fibers, and 50% of their of their skeletal muscles will be of the type 2 variety, fast twitch. Now, we do know certain muscle groups tend to be more slow twitch, like your postural muscles, the soleus, which is one of your calf muscles. Some muscle groups tend to be more fast twitch, like triceps, okay? So there can be variations in muscle groups as far as percentages of slow twitch versus fast twitch fibers. But if you just look at the average person walking the street and you look at all their muscle groups and all the muscle fibers in their body, about 50% are going to be type 1 slow twitch and 50% type 2 fast twitch. Elite endurance athletes may have 80% slow twitch muscle fibers type 1 and only 20% type 2 fast twitch. And then you look at the other end of the spectrum, sprinters, elite power athletes, maybe Olympic weightlifters, they may be 80, 90% fast twitch type 2 fibers and 20 to 10% slow twitch type 1, okay? And again, some of this is tied in with genetics, but also training. We do know, and this was debated for years, but I've had Dr. Andy Fry on before, and he studied muscle fiber types for years and training and performance. We do know the type of training you do can cause some conversion between these different fiber types, right? So maybe if you have a lot of slow twitch fibers, type 1, but you start doing a lot of resistance training and sprinting and plyometrics and jumping, explosive movements, you may start to convert some of those type 1 fibers into the type 2 fast twitch variety. Opposite could occur. Maybe you have 70, 80% type 2 fast twitch fibers, but you stop doing resistance training and sprinting and plyometrics and explosive exercise, and you start doing more endurance-based training, going long cycling, marathons, things like that. Maybe you become a triathlete. You may start to switch your fiber type into more of a type 2 or type 1 variety, right? So there can be some conversion due to training and also then just, how you were born. So there's an interplay here between the type of training and your genetics. So the type 1 fibers, they tend to be more efficient at using oxygen. So type 1 fibers have a lot of mitochondria, and the mitochondria are considered the powerhouse or like the power plant of the cell. It's inside the mitochondria where we can oxidize using the help of oxygen. We can burn carbohydrates and fats and even amino acids to produce ATP, which is the fuel that our muscles need to contract and relax, okay? And so type 1 fibers, because they have many, many mitochondria, they're very efficient at producing energy in the form of ATP, and that's great for extended muscle contractions over a long period of time. So that's why we say these type 1 fibers, because of their makeup, they're very fatigue resistant, okay? So if you have a lot of these, you're probably going to be able to run for days, not get tired. You'll do well in endurance activities. However, the one downside is these type 1 fibers are much smaller in diameter. So they're smaller diameter muscle fibers. There's less contractile proteins in there. So they don't produce as much force as, say, the type 2 fibers. So if we look at type 2 fibers, if you have a lot of those, a high percentage of these, you're generally going to be better at generating short bursts of strength or speed. So you may be able to vertical jump really high, broad jump really far. You may be really good at, like, say, a 100-meter sprint or a 40-yard dash. You probably do really well in the weight room with strength training. You're probably very strong naturally, all right, if you have a lot of these type 2 fibers. These type 2 fibers tend to be larger diameter, okay? So you have a larger diameter fiber. What's inside those fibers? A bunch of actin and myosin proteins. And if you have more actin and myosin proteins packed into these fibers, those proteins are responsible for muscle contraction. They bind together and kind of pull on each other. And if you have more of those proteins available in these larger diameter fibers, you're going to be able to produce more force. All right, so, and you know that intuitively, right? Larger fibers, whether they're larger due to genetics or maybe you've been doing resistance training for several years, you're probably going to have larger muscles. Those larger fibers that have more protein packed inside them, they're going to be able to produce more force than smaller muscle fibers, generally speaking, okay? So again, these larger diameter fibers, although they can produce more force, they do fatigue more rapidly. And some people naturally have more fast twitch fibers, as I mentioned, and may therefore find it easier to gain muscle because the potential for growth is greater if you have a lot of type 2 fibers than, say, type 1, okay? So your overall percent of type 1 versus type 2 fibers depends on genetics and the type of training that you do. So skeletal structure. We do know that people with larger bones, they may be able to support more muscle mass. Okay, and so again, this is kind of tied into your genetics. You know, and if you have a larger framework, that's going to provide for muscle attachments and the development of a greater muscle mass. Hormones. So got to mention these. They obviously play a role in muscle growth. So some of the anabolic hormones, anabolic meaning they're going to help promote the growth of muscle tissue. And when I say muscle growth, again, that term hypertrophy. So some of these hormones that are going to help to enable or allow hypertrophy to occur if your levels are normal or maybe even at the high end of normal. Testosterone, growth hormone, insulin-like growth factor 1, as I mentioned earlier, IGF-1, insulin, estrogens, these all have anabolic roles, and they can all play a role in increasing muscle protein synthesis, reducing muscle protein degradation or breakdown, and stimulating muscle growth. Okay, so hormone levels can be influenced by a lot of things. You know, why do some people have higher levels of, say, testosterone or IGF-1 or growth hormone, and other people have lower levels? So some of this is just due to your overall health. Some of it is due to your age. A lot of these anabolic hormones decline as you get older, right? So if you look at the testosterone and growth hormone levels of an individual that's in their 80s versus somebody that's 21, Testosterone and growth hormone are going to be a lot lower in somebody that's 80 versus 21, right? So age can be a factor. Gender, right? We know males tend to have 10 to 20 times higher levels of testosterone circulating in the blood than females. Estrogen levels, they tend to be higher in females than males, right? So there are differences due to age, sex, and just overall health. If you're in a disease state, a lot of these anabolic hormones, they tend to be lower, right? Because if you're sick, your body's not so concerned about building muscle and growing muscle tissue. It's trying to get over whatever condition it is that you're struggling with. So this slide here just shows a nice chart that kind of summarizes these different hormones and then their respective actions. So if we look at insulin-like growth factor 1, talked about that a bit earlier, but its primary hypertrophic effects of the systemic isoform, there's different isoforms or variants of this hormone, but the systemic form that's produced by the liver, okay, so the way IGF-1 release, the systemic form occurs is the pituitary gland in the brain releases growth hormone. Growth hormone gets into the blood, binds to receptors in the liver, and then that stimulates the liver to release IGF-1, and then that's going to appear in the circulation, travel throughout the bloodstream, and look for receptors to bind to. And some of those receptors are going to be on muscle cells, okay? So when IGF-1 binds to receptors on muscle cells, its primary hypertrophic effect appears to be stimulating differentiation and fusion following myotrauma, so muscle trauma, and thereby facilitating the donation of myonuclei. So this is muscle nuclei to muscle fibers. All right. If we look at growth hormone is interesting. Like I said, it's released from the brain. It may help kind of potentiate the effect of IGF-1. It causes IGF-1 to be released from the liver into the systemic circulation. Growth hormone, it's thought of, maybe has less of an effect on muscle tissue growth, but more on increasing the synthesis of collagen, which is an important protein in connective tissue. Okay, so growth hormone can definitely affect the growth of bones and connective tissue. It's kind of debatable about its effect on muscle growth, but it also has a very important role in lipolysis or fat breakdown. So this is one reason why bodybuilders often will abuse growth hormone is high growth hormone levels signal an increased release of fat from your fat cells, right? And so it can really help kind of promote fat loss. Testosterone, this directly increases myofibrillar protein synthesis. So testosterone, when it binds to the receptor inside muscle cells, is going to help turn on those intracellular signaling pathways like mTOR that eventually tells the ribosomes in the cells to increase the production of protein in those muscle fibers, right? And if you're turning on and switching on protein synthesis, producing more protein in the muscle fibers, those muscle fibers are going to grow larger as a result, okay? Testosterone also decreases proteolysis. So not only does it enhance protein synthesis, which is going to lead to more protein packed in each fiber and greater individual fiber size, greater overall muscle size. If it decreases proteolysis, this means it's reducing protein breakdown, right? So less protein breakdown, more protein synthesis. You can see how that's going to lead to greater muscle growth, all right? And insulin then, this hormone's released from the pancreas. I should mention, testosterone's released from the testes in males. Females also, the ovaries produce some testosterone, but more of it comes from the adrenal gland that's located on top of the kidney. But insulin is released from the pancreas, and it plays a huge role in blood sugar regulation. Insulin promotes the uptake of glucose into your cells, but it also, primary effect here is that it is believed to reduce protein breakdown. Okay, so at physiological levels, insulin is not thought to stimulate increases in muscle protein synthesis, but it helps to prevent muscle from breaking down and from protein being degraded, right? If your insulin levels are normal, okay? So you'll have less muscle tissue loss as long as those insulin levels are normal. Now, again, some professional bodybuilders will abuse insulin and take it exogenously. If you raise insulin levels above your physiologic range, above the normal range, that then can enhance muscle protein synthesis, okay? All right, so we went through those anabolic hormones. Let's get into resistance training now and how that affects muscle growth. So our fifth factor here. So we know that resistance training builds muscle. Really, it's thought through three mechanisms: mechanical tension, muscle damage, and metabolic stress. Now, I have mechanical tension in bold there and underlined because this is thought to be the main factor via which resistance training builds muscle, right? So you think about it, you apply a load to the muscle, right? Like I'm doing a bench press or an overhead shoulder press, right? I'm applying an external load. That load that I'm having to lift is going to now, if I'm going to overcome that load, my muscles are going to have to produce more force, right? And by producing more force over time and requiring my muscle cells to produce more force, now there's mechanical tension on those fibers. And ultimately, what happens is you have mechanotransduction that occurs where you have these little mechanosensors on the muscle cell membrane, and they sense muscle stretch, muscle tension, the increased force that you're trying to produce. And those mechanosensors that are on the muscle fibers then switch on signaling pathways inside the cell. Some of these we talked about, like the mTOR pathway. And when these signaling pathways are switched on, that can lead to the transcription of genes and the production of proteins that ultimately lead to muscle growth. All right, so mechanical tension is a main driver, the primary driver of muscle growth. It is thought that, and anybody knows this that has worked out before and has trained in the weight room, oftentimes 24 to 48 hours after you do a lifting session, you're going to feel a little muscle soreness, or maybe a lot, until your body becomes accustomed to lifting, which could take several weeks of training. But if you're new to it, starting out, yeah, you're going to be sore. And there is going to be some muscle damage, micro trauma, some little small tears in the fibers, and those have to be repaired. And this is thought to be one driver. How are you going to repair those fibers? Well, you got to increase protein synthesis. You've got to have satellite cells come in and fuse to the fibers, and those satellite cells help repair those damaged fibers. So there's a whole chain of events happening inside your muscle cells. Inflammation after a workout helps drive muscle repair and repair that micro trauma. So again, your body's trying to build back fibers, repair them, so that when you go do your next bout of training, you know that you're going to be ready to go. And then also metabolic stress. So what is that? Well, when you're doing a resistance training session, and you're requiring those muscles to contract and produce force against the load, you're going to burn fuel like glycogen and phosphocreatine. And when you break down glycogen, which is stored carbohydrate that's in your muscle cells, you produce some metabolites, right? So glycogen gets broken down by many different enzymes. You may produce some lactate, some hydrogen ions. You're going to have, as ATP, your energy gets broken down. You're going to have inorganic phosphates being released. So these are all metabolites that build up in the cell, muscle cell, due to repetitive muscle contraction when you're lifting weights. And it's thought that some of these metabolites, like the lactate that builds up as glycogen's broken down, and the inorganic phosphate that builds up as your ATP gets broken down, some of these metabolites may actually signal the cell to, increase protein synthesis, decrease protein breakdown, and then if you have that occurring, that would lead to an enhancement in muscle growth. Okay, so again, several mechanisms here, although it's thought the main driver, again, is mechanical tension, right? So like I said, you apply a load to the muscle tissue, you're lifting weights. There are literally mechanosensors on the cell membrane of your muscle cells, and they sense this tension and this increase in force that you're trying to produce, and that switches on those signaling pathways in the cell that lead to, you're going to switch on the pathways that cause an increase in protein synthesis, and you're going to blunt or inhibit many of the pathways as you recover that are involved in muscle protein degradation. Although during the actual workout there's going to be some muscle protein breakdown, it's afterwards during recovery where the protein synthesis is going to outpace muscle protein breakdown or degradation, right? Because after the workouts, when that protein synthesis is really ramped up, plus if you're taking in an adequate number of calories, you're eating in a calorie surplus, you're taking in adequate protein, that really helps enhance muscle protein synthesis after a workout, and your muscle protein synthesis pathways are going to be working overtime, cranking, and then the muscle protein degradation pathways are going to be blunted, okay? So mechanical overload, resistance training, as I mentioned, best achieves skeletal muscle hypertrophy. If you're an endurance athlete and you do a lot of running, you may get a little bit of growth in like your quadricep muscles and some of those muscles, but endurance activity, it doesn't really stimulate muscle growth like resistance training does. So resistance training, weightlifting, strength training, that's going to be your best way to apply a load to muscle, achieve that mechanical tension, and switch on those pathways that lead to skeletal muscle hypertrophy, which is hypertrophy is muscle growth. So single sessions of mechanical overload and resistance training induce transient or temporary increases in mammalian or mechanistic target of rapamycin complex 1, mTOR-C1 signaling, which leads to elevations in muscle protein synthesis rates. So mTOR-C1 is an important molecule, protein complex inside your muscle cells that can get switched on or activated in response to a single session of resistance training. And think about it, if you're repeating these resistance training sessions over time, maybe 3 times, 4 times, 5 times a week, maybe even 6 times a week, you're going to get more signaling through this mTOR-C1 complex that's going to ultimately lead to those ribosomes, these cellular organelles, cranking out, producing more protein, synthesizing more protein in those cells. And of course, you need a good calorie intake and a high protein diet. That's going to just help this complex work even better so that you can produce more of those muscle contractile proteins like actin and myosin. If you're producing more of those contractile proteins in muscle, in each muscle fiber, you're going to ultimately over time be able to produce more force, and more protein in the muscle fibers means you're going to have larger muscle fibers and larger muscles in general. So repeated sessions of mechanical overload and resistance training causing increased muscle protein synthesis is going to lead to the accumulation of muscle protein in larger diameter fibers, as I mentioned. And one way that's occurring is through this mTOR-C1 signaling complex, okay? Approximately 2 months of training, resistance training, is needed for apparent increases in muscle size, okay? So and working with the younger individuals, like back when I was a strength coach and trainer, a lot of times high school athletes would ask me if they were just starting out training, well, I feel like I'm getting stronger, but when am I going to see increases in muscle size? So generally increases in strength precede increases in muscle mass and size, right? So a lot of times the initial 8 weeks, that initial 2 months, you're getting stronger because there are changes in the nervous system. There's neurological adaptations that occur. And then after about 2 months of training, you really start to see some changes in muscle size because all of those training sessions, each individual session over the course of those 2 months, there's this cumulative effect. That mTOR pathway is getting switched on, that muscle protein synthesis pathway is being switched on each time you do a training session. And then you include in recovery, which is when the muscles actually grow, right? The diet, the protein intake, maybe any supplements they're taking like creatine. This is going to help really increase protein synthesis during those recovery periods. And then you train again, that provides mechanical tension. Then you recover, right? Adequate protein intake, adequate calories. Train again, that applies mechanical tension. So over time, you just keep switching on those protein synthesis pathways inside the muscle fiber. And after about 2 to 3 months, you're going to start to notice, oh, the muscle cells have become larger because you've been increasing protein synthesis weekly, daily and weekly over the months. You finally start to see it, okay? You see the changes. They become apparent. This just shows a couple different pathways again. You see the lightning bolt at the top that says tensile stress. So if you think about muscle tissue that is, again, undergoing, you apply a load to during a resistance training session, you're going to have increased tensile stress, mechanical tension. That's going to result from resistance training, and that causes mechanotransduction. So what mechanotransduction is that mechanical stress that these receptors on the muscle cell membrane sense gets converted into molecular signaling inside the muscle fiber, the cytoplasm of the cell there. And so you switch on many enzymes and proteins inside the muscle cell in response to that mechanical stress. And when those molecules, those proteins, those enzymes, all those signaling molecules inside the muscle fiber get switched on due to the mechanical stress, that's called mechanotransduction. Okay, so many of those you see in blue on the right-hand side there. You see those green arrows. AKT is an enzyme that activates mTORC1. I mentioned how mTORC1 needs to be activated to cause the ribosomes to initiate the production or the translation of proteins, right? So again, those ribosomes are just these manufacturing plants that take amino acids in from the cell, the cytoplasm, they link them together, and you're going to get a lot of proteins produced there. That's their role, is to produce proteins, right? And of course, genes being switched on, they also signal those ribosomes to crank out proteins. But in this case, mechanotransduction, this is where the mechanical forces in muscle are converted into molecular events inside the muscle cells, these signaling cascades that mediate intracellular signaling pathways. So that mTORC1 is activated, and the ignition of protein translation and protein synthesis in the ribosomes then gets activated. So green arrows represent pathways that promote increased muscle protein synthesis, so like activation of that mTORC1, and that increased muscle protein synthesis leads to increased muscle growth. The red blocked bars, kind of those T-bars, those represent pathways that inhibit muscle protein synthesis and muscle growth. And you can see, God, there's just so many. Like one of the inhibitory pathways there, you see in orange at the top, in that orange oval, MSTN, that's your myostatin protein. So if that myostatin protein binds to the receptor, that's going to switch on those inhibitory pathways. You see how through myostatin binding to its receptor, you follow that green arrow down and you see those SMAD proteins there, like SMAD2 and 3. SMAD2 and 3 get phosphorylated. You see the P there. When they're phosphorylated, the SMAD2 and 3 proteins then block or inhibit the AKT-PKB enzyme. And if that enzyme, AKT and PKB, is blocked and it can't do what it normally does, that enzyme cannot signal mTORC1 to be switched on, and if mTORC1 is not switched on, then you don't get the initiation of protein translation or protein synthesis. So again, myostatin binds to its receptor, causes SMAD2 and 3 to be phosphorylated, and then SMAD2 and 3 block that protein synthesis pathway, those blue ovals on the right side. AKT and mTORC1 don't get activated, so protein synthesis is inhibited. And then also that SMAD complex, SMAD2 and 3 and 4, you see how they can block genes that are involved, the transcription of genes involved in muscle growth inside the nucleus of muscle cells, right? So you see that red T-bar blocking those genes involved in muscle growth inside the nucleus of the cell. Again, that's another role of myostatin, inhibiting muscle growth, okay? So really it's on that right side there. All those kind of blue ovals and the green arrows, those are your muscle protein synthesis pathways. And then on the left-hand side, especially like myostatin, right? And you see the red bars branching off those SMAD proteins. That's going to inhibit the protein synthesis pathways and then also inhibit the transcription of genes involved in muscle growth inside the nucleus. All right, so continuing on with resistance training here, you can't just do one resistance training and expect muscle growth to happen, right? You have to repeat resistance training sessions or bouts over days, weeks, and months, right? You need to consistently apply mechanical overload, mechanical tension to your muscle fibers. You need to progressively overload them over time, and you'll eventually going to see some changes in that muscle tissue. So what do these repeated resistance training bouts do? One, they increase ribosome biogenesis. Remember what the ribosomes do. Those are an organelle out in the cytoplasm of your muscle cells they're responsible for producing proteins, right? And remember, muscle's about 20 to 25% protein. So if you can increase the number of ribosomes that are formed in a cell, which is ribosome biogenesis, if you have more ribosomes available, you're going to have a greater capacity to produce more muscle protein as a result of having a greater number of ribosomes, all right? And resistance training repeated over time can help increase the number of ribosomes that you produce in your muscle cells, which can lead to a greater capacity to produce muscle proteins, okay? Also, repeated bouts of resistance training increase satellite cell abundance and myonuclear accretion. I'll talk about that in a bit, but satellite cells are these cells that kind of are out on the periphery of muscle fibers. And when they're activated, they can actually go in and fuse to muscle fibers, and they can signal the repair of muscle tissue. They can also donate nuclei. So there you see that term myonuclear. These satellite cells can donate nuclei to muscle fibers. And if muscle fibers have more nuclei, that's going to help to increase or improve muscle protein synthesis. And then again, just repeated resistance training because of that repeated mechanical tension and some of these other events that I just mentioned, you're going to have a greater capacity to translate and synthesize muscle proteins. So again, increased ribosome biogenesis, satellite cell abundance, the accretion of muscle nuclei, myonuclear accretion, they all combine to allow for a greater capacity to translate and synthesize muscle proteins, which if you're translating, synthesizing more proteins in each muscle fiber, then each muscle fiber is going to grow larger, and the whole muscle group, whatever muscle group you're training, it's going to hypertrophy and grow larger. And hopefully you're training all the muscle groups in your body, not just upper or not just lower, but you want that to be happening all throughout the body if you're training correctly for to develop muscle mass. So this just shows on this slide that increased ribosome biogenesis resulting from performing resistance training sessions consistently over time occurs. And what researchers have shown is that ribosome biogenesis, so that term biogenesis means the creation of new ribosomes, right? So researchers have shown that in response to repeated bouts of resistance training, inside your muscle cells, your muscle fibers, one of the primary events that happens is you're going to increase the number of these ribosomes, right? So the number of the ribosomes go up, and you see there in that myofiber, that muscle fiber on the left, there's only 2 ribosomes, and then with repeated training, you increase that to 4 ribosomes, right? Those little purple, you can see in purple there in the muscle fibers. So those ribosomes increase in number, and again, what do the ribosomes do? That's where proteins get produced. So the resistance training switches on the creation of, these genes are going to get switched on that produce more ribosomes. And when you have more ribosomes available, you now have more factories basically to produce protein in the muscle fiber, all right? And so you see on the graph there at the bottom over the days, the weeks, and months that the ribosome content goes up, so that increases your muscle protein translation capacity. So that orange line in the middle goes up. And then what's correlated with that, as that orange line, you see that linear increase in the ribosome content, the number of ribosomes. The purple line at the top on the graph, that's your tissue and muscle fiber hypertrophy. So your tissue growth, your muscle growth is going up as the number of ribosomes, the ribosome content grows up. And what drives an increase in the ribosome number and content? Repeated resistance training over time, okay? Now this slide shows, I want to focus on the left-hand side, the fusion role. So this is a general overview of how satellite cells can respond to mechanical overload and resistance training. Now remember, the satellite cells, like a satellite may be orbiting around the Earth, the satellite cells are kind of located on the outside of the muscle fiber underneath the sarcolemma, the cell membrane. Okay, and these are usually in a quiescent or quiet state, but resistance training can activate them, okay? So you apply mechanical overload, mechanical tension to your muscle fibers, that can activate these satellite cells, and then they can proliferate. You see that short-term overload in the arrow, they can proliferate, increase in number, and then fuse to the muscle cell, okay? So first you have the acute response, which is proliferation and increase in number of those cells in response to resistance training, followed by some of these are going to fuse to the muscle fibers and then donate myonuclei, right? So myo meaning muscle, nuclei, right? So you have to remember that skeletal muscle fibers are multinucleated. They have many, many nuclei. Other cells in our body just have a single nuclei, but muscle fibers have many, many nuclei. And this is important because some muscles can be several feet long, muscle fibers, right? Like think of some of the muscles in the legs. And because muscle fibers are so long, they need to have many nuclei located along their length so that those fibers can carry out all the normal processes, all right? And so satellite cells can fuse to these muscle fibers and actually donate nuclei. And that is thought to increase the muscle fiber's capacity to synthesize new contractile proteins, right? And if you're synthesizing more and new contractile proteins like actin and myosin, those are the proteins that are literally responsible for binding together, and myosin pulls on the actin when a muscle is contracting, and that's going to allow you to produce force. You produce more of those proteins, again, your fibers are going to get larger, you're going to have hypertrophy, right? So this response to resistance training is considered obligatory for maximizing overload-induced hypertrophy. I won't talk about the non-fusion role, so we'll go on to this next slide. So tips here for maximizing muscle hypertrophy and muscle growth when it comes to resistance training, all right? So how can we really maximize our muscle protein synthesis, our muscle growth and hypertrophy through training? So just some general tips. I've covered this in another episode in detail, but I wanted to highlight it here. Training frequency. So if you're new to working out, or you're trying to think where to start, you know, typically you may start out just training a couple times a week, but you can progress your frequency over time as you become more well-trained. Typically with training frequency, you can gain muscle, you can grow muscle and stimulate muscle hypertrophy if you trained each muscle group once a week, right? So maybe you go in on Monday, you train your chest, you go in on Tuesday, you resistance train your back, you go in on Wednesday, you train your shoulders, on Thursday, maybe you train biceps, and on Friday you train triceps, and then you rest on the weekend, and then you repeat that. So you maybe, you know, you've trained, did I have legs in there? I think I did, but you should have legs in there too. So you train each muscle group once a week, okay? You can definitely grow and build muscle that way. Is it gonna be optimal if you're training each muscle group once a week? No, it's not. So 2 to 3 times training each muscle group a week, you're gonna get more muscle growth and you're gonna develop more muscle mass. So 2 is kind of a sweet spot. So if you could train your chest twice a week, evenly spaced out with, you know, 48 to 72 hours rest. So maybe you train chest Monday and then you train it again Thursday. Maybe you train legs Tuesday, and then you train them again Friday, right? So you're spacing out those workouts to where you're training each muscle group twice a week. That's going to allow you to develop more muscle mass than, say, if you were training each muscle group once a week. Now, you might think, well, if 2 is good, is 3 going to be better? And, well, what about training 4? What about I just train each muscle group every day? You would get minute, really tiny gains if you really are trying to train each muscle group more than 2 or 3 times a week, and then you start to risk overtraining and maybe injury. So really training each muscle group 2 times a week is going to help optimize and maximize muscle growth while limiting the risk of overtraining and injury, and also just mental burnout. So 2 times a week is kind of a sweet spot. And to train each muscle group twice a week, use split routines, meaning you're splitting your muscle groups up that you train each day. So maybe on Monday, this is a common routine, you might train the muscles that are involved in pushing weights, like with the upper body. So your push muscles in the upper body are chest, shoulders, and triceps, right? So you may do bench press or dumbbell presses or flies or overhead presses, tricep press downs, tricep extensions, dips. Those are all examples of exercises that utilize those push muscles, the muscles you use to push a load away from you. Then Tuesday would be a pull day. So what are your pull muscles? Your upper back muscles, your biceps. So you think of pull-ups or lat pull-downs, dumbbell rows, barbell rows, bicep curls using dumbbells or barbells, maybe preacher curls. You're working all your pull muscles on Tuesday. And then Wednesday would be a leg day. So squats, deadlifts, Romanian deadlifts, leg press, lunges, leg extensions, leg curls, calf raises. That's your leg day on Wednesday. Then Thursday would be a rest day. And then Friday, you would repeat Monday's push workout. Saturday, you would repeat Tuesday's pull workout. And then Sunday, you would repeat the leg workout that you did, say, on Wednesday. And then the following week, week 2, Monday would be your rest day. So you're basically lifting 3 days on, 1 day off, 3 days on, 1 day off. Okay, that's a routine for more advanced lifters. I wouldn't recommend that for somebody just starting out. But if you've been training for several years, that's a good split routine to use. An upper-lower body split is a good one, maybe for somebody starting out. So here, maybe on Monday, you do all your upper body muscles. Tuesday, you do lower body muscles. Wednesday, rest. Thursday, you do upper body muscles. Friday, you do lower body muscles. And then the weekend, you rest and don't do any resistance training. Okay? All right, so sets. You might ask, how many sets do I need to do per muscle group per week to optimize, right, or maximize muscle hypertrophy? Research is indicating between 10 and 20 total sets per muscle group per week. Okay, so again, maybe if somebody's on that push-pull legs routine, maybe they do 5 to 6 sets of chest exercises on Monday, and then they come back later in the week on what would that be? Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. They're repeating the push workout again, and they do another 5 to 6 sets of chest exercises. So maybe they do 3 sets of bench press and then 3 sets of incline press, right? So again, just trying to get in 10 to 20 total sets per muscle group per week to maximize muscle growth. Now, advanced lifters may need a little bit more. We don't really know where the cap is on this yet. I mean, 21 to 35 sets per muscle group per week is a lot, and that's also, a lot to recover from, and mentally, that's a lot to pack in. But generally 10 to 20 sets, training each muscle group, 10 to 20 sets per week is going to be sufficient, okay? Because again, once you start getting above that 20 sets per muscle group per week, you may get a little more growth, but you're also risking injury and overtraining and burnout. So I think for most people, try to train each muscle group, get in 10 to 20 sets per week. And especially if you're trying to do 15 to 20 sets of chest, don't do all that in one day. divide that up, right? So if you're wanting to do 20 sets of chest in a week, do 10 on Monday and then 10 on Friday. Or same thing with legs. Don't try to do 20 sets of legs in one workout. Divide that into 2 sessions of 10 sets, okay, with some equally spaced rest periods in between, okay? And then if you look at reps and loads, use loads that allow 6 to 12 reps. That's going to allow for efficient training. Heavier loads that allow 1 to 5 reps per set, those are going to be needed if you want to optimize your muscle strength. Okay, so, somewhere in that 1 to 12 rep range. I mean, personally, I like to have days where I go heavier because, I don't want to just have muscle size. I also want to have muscle strength. So, unfortunately, right now I'm recovering from an injury, so I'm not able to go very heavy on certain exercises. But when I'm on my normal training routine, I will have days where a lot of my multi-joint exercises, squats or bench or deadlifts, are in that 1 to 5 rep range because I want to stay strong. But 6 to 12 is a great rep range for building muscle, allowing muscle growth to occur. So I have a lot of days where I kind of focus on that rep range as well. Okay. Rest periods. So greater than or equal to 2 to 3 minutes between sets is going to be sufficient for most multi-joint exercises. Your multi-joint exercises are your big compound lifts like an overhead press, bench press, a barbell row, leg press, squats, lunges. These are all multi-joint exercises where you have multiple joints moving and you have multiple muscle groups involved in that movement. Okay, and because you have multiple muscle groups working, these can be more fatiguing, so you generally need longer rest periods to recover so you can perform the next set with the same intensity than you would if you were doing single joint exercises. So you can see the arrow below, that next arrow. You don't need as long as rest periods, so a minute to minute and a half, 60 to 90 seconds. If you're doing a bunch of single joint exercises, like maybe it's an arm day and you're just going in and working your biceps and triceps, those are smaller muscles. If you're doing curls or you're doing tricep extensions, the only joint really moving there is the elbow. So that's a single joint exercise. You're working a smaller amount of muscle mass, muscle tissue. So it doesn't take as long to recover between sets. You're not burning through as much ATP and fuel. So you can recover easier, and therefore you have shorter rest periods, okay? If you're using really heavy loads, right, like you're working in that rep range where you're doing loads where maybe you can only get between 1 and 5 reps, like you're doing a heavy set of 3 on bench press or squats, and you're going to be tired, right? Lifting that heavy load, you're going to burn through a lot of phosphocreatine, and you're going to need a longer period of time to recover, bring those phosphocreatine levels back up between sets. So you may need greater than 3 minutes. You may need 5-6 minutes between sets. Like if you're doing heavy singles, a heavy set of 2 or 3 reps, especially when it's legs, you may need 4, 5, 6 minutes to recover between sets before you've regenerated enough phosphocreatine to provide the fuel to produce your ATP for that next set. Okay, so when you're lifting heavy, don't be afraid to take long rest periods. Okay. All right, exercise selection and order. So continuing on with these tips to help you maximize muscle hypertrophy, muscle growth. I love free weights. I'd say about 2/3 of my workout each time I go to the gym is free weights, and about 1/3 of it is cables and machines. Usually I'm starting out with free weights. I may use some cables to kind of warm up, but initially I really... That first 66% or 2/3 of my workout is going to be a lot of free weight exercises, basic stuff, basic movements. Don't get too fancy. And then the last third, a lot of cables, machines. So perform multi-joint exercises early in your workout prior to single joint exercises. This is just good for anyone to follow, whether you're a new trainee, a newbie, or somebody that's been training for a long time. It's best to perform the most fatiguing exercises that are multi-joint and involve a lot of muscle mass first, right? I mean, it doesn't make sense to do like a leg extension or calf raises or hamstring curls and then go try to do squats or deadlifts, right? So do your large movements that incorporate multiple joints first, because those are going to be most fatiguing, right? So do your squats, your deadlifts, your leg press, your lunges, all of those first. Then you can work down to the single joint exercises, right? Leg extensions, leg curls, calf raises, etc. All right. Big advocate of using a full range of motion when you perform exercises. That's going to help allow you to remain mobile and flexible, and it's just a good policy to work through a full range of motion. I know there's a lot of research coming out on training at, doing lengthened partials, or, some muscles may respond a little better if you train them at, elongated, lengths. You're really getting off into the weeds there. I'd say that the best policy is just train your muscles through a full range of motion when you're performing your resistance training exercises. And that research is kind of murky on the lengthened partial training. So, and it can depend on the group as well. So training to failure, question mark there. Most training sets should be completed within 1 or 2 reps, with 1 or 2 reps in reserve. So maybe you do a set of 8, 9, 10 reps of, overhead shoulder presses, and you're like, I can do 1 more, but I'm going to leave that rep in the tank, save it, fully recover, then do your next set. So you want to train close to failure. That's this reps in reserve. I mean, if you leave too many reps in reserve, like 4 or 5 reps in reserve, you're not training close enough to failure to really stimulate muscle growth, muscle protein synthesis. And yeah, you can also take sets to complete muscular failure as well. I mean, if you really feel fatigued, or you're really kind of struggling mentally to get through a workout, maybe you didn't sleep well the night before, maybe you haven't taken in many calories that day, and you're like, oh, I can't take each set to failure. Well, just try to go to where there's 1 or 2 reps in reserve. But the closer you can train to failure, the better it is going to be for maximizing muscle growth and switching on muscle protein synthesis. So either train to failure, or train to where you just have like 1 or 2 reps left that you could complete before stopping the set. Repetition speed and duration. So how fast should you complete your reps during a set? Wide range can be utilized. But definitely there's research showing that if you're training at very slow durations, like 10 seconds per rep, like you're lowering the load really, really slowly and then pushing it up really, really slowly, that's going to be suboptimal for increasing muscle size. And, really, if your goal is strength and power, I always tell people no matter how heavy the load is, you should be trying to move that load as fast as possible, okay? Especially on the concentric phase, like on a bench, if you're trying to push it off your chest, even if it's a heavy load, try to push it off your chest as fast as possible, okay? That can help improve your power. And, again, it's a wide range of repetition speeds. The main thing is you don't want to be, bouncing loads, using momentum. Obviously, then that can be hard on your joints. So you want to be controlled with your movement. But really during the concentric phase, I'm a big fan of trying to explode the load, but definitely control it on the eccentric, on the lowering phase. You don't want to be bouncing loads off your chest or anything like that. So standard control, don't utilize momentum, keep that tension on the muscle. And on the concentric phase, when you're moving a load, definitely I would try to move it as fast as possible. Now, obviously, heavy loads, you're not going to be able to move as fast as lighter loads, but still that intent should be there. You should be lifting with intent, right? So if you're coming up from a squat and you got a heavy load on your back, yeah, it's not going to move as fast as a lighter load, but you should still be trying to explode up off the ground and move that heavy load as fast as you can, in my opinion, especially for strength and power development, in addition to the hypertrophy. Alrighty, so continuing on here with more tips to maximize muscle hypertrophy from your resistance training. Major emphasis, can't emphasize it enough, is just to train consistently over time. And so you need to use progressive overload. okay? And so progressive overload, here's where you're going to be adding more weight, more load to your muscles over time. You can also overload by adding more volume up to a point, although you can get to a point where maybe you're doing too much volume. Kind of stick within those volume ranges that I gave previously on another slide. So with progressive overload, you're increasing the number of sets, reps to a point, or the load, all right? And an example of this is, let's say that you're an untrained individual, you're just starting out doing resistance training. Maybe you're doing like 2 full body workouts in a week on like a Monday and a Friday, okay? So there's evenly spaced rest days in between, and then you decide to go to lifting 3 days a week. So then maybe you split your body up into an upper body day training on Monday, a lower body day on Wednesday, and another upper body training session Friday. And then week 2, it would be flipped where you'd start lower body on Monday, upper body Wednesday, lower body Friday. And then maybe you increase the frequency and progress again to doing 4 days a week, right? So you can also increase the frequency there. So you're going to be basically creating, more workouts during the week, more chances to increase protein synthesis and stimulate that muscle tissue more frequently throughout the week. But, you wouldn't want to start out doing 4, 5, 6 training sessions in a week if you're just starting out and you're an untrained individual. So you'd want to progress up to that. And then again, maybe you progress the volume. So if you're starting out only training 2 days a week, this is your first day, you've never resistance trained before, maybe you do only 1 or 2 sets per muscle group, right? And you're doing like a full body routine on that Monday and Friday. And so you do 1 or 2 sets for your legs and 1 or 2 sets for your back and 1 or 2 sets for the arms, 1 or 2 sets for chest. So again, your volume's low, starting out training that way, and then you can progress that volume. And volume is the total number of sets and reps in a workout. So you start adding in more sets as you progress through the weeks and months, right? Increasing that volume. And then also, you also increase the load. Typically, I don't recommend increasing the volume and the load at the same time, so increase one or the other. And you might ask, well, how much should I increase the load over time? You don't have to increase the load, add more weight every workout. You don't need to do that every session. But generally, I recommend increasing the load for upper body lifts by about 2.5 to 10 pounds, right? 5 to 10 pounds for upper body lifts. And then for lower body lifts, anywhere from 10 to over 30 pound increases, right? If you're a little more well-trained and stronger, you can make bigger jumps. If you're less trained and weaker, smaller jumps. But anywhere from adding, if you want to go percentages, a 2.5% up to a 10% load increase when you decide you want to increase that weight is reasonable. And one rule you can use to decide when to increase weight is called the 2x2 rule. So let's say you're doing a set, or let's say you're doing some barbell back squats and you're going to do 4 sets. And your goal is to squat 200 pounds 10 times each set, okay? Let's say you get 10 reps in that first set with 200 pounds, 10 reps in the second, 10 reps in the third, and then in the fourth set, you're actually able to complete 2 more reps than your goal, like you get 12 reps. Okay, you've completed 2 more reps than your goal number of reps in that workout. Then you come back in several days later, maybe 72 hours later, and you're doing barbell back squats again. And let's say first set you get 8 reps, second set 9, third set 8, fourth set, again, you're feeling pretty good and you end up getting 12 reps. You get 2 more reps than your goal number of reps, which was 10. You've done that now 2 workouts in a row. So if you complete 2 more reps than your goal number of reps in the last set of the exercise, 2 workouts in a row, then the next time you come in, that third time that you're going to train, you're going to increase the load and make a jump in weight. Okay, so that's the 2x2 rule, is if you can complete 2 more reps in the last set of an exercise on 2 consecutive training sessions, then that third time that you would come in, you can go ahead and increase the load. And like I said, increase it by 2.5 to 10%. If it's a lower body exercise like this, you could make a 10-pound to maybe even over 30-pound increase, depending on how strong you are. So that's an example of progressive overload. You've got to consistently apply more load, more work, meaning more volume, if you want to stimulate continued increases in muscle hypertrophy and muscle growth, right? Because you got to think about it, as these training sessions compile and you build them up over time, each session you're stimulating that muscle protein synthesis that I talked about. And when you apply load to the muscle, that's producing that mechanical tension that I described earlier. And as that muscle grows larger over time, it's going to get stronger and you're going to be able to produce more force. And so to maintain the same level of mechanical tension, you're going to need to apply more load to that muscle tissue because it's getting larger and stronger, so that it has to produce more force and then more mechanical tension over time to overcome those heavier loads. Okay, so it's very important, this progressive overload over time. And then, also you can throw in some days and weeks where maybe you drop the load down, you have maybe a week where you take it off and you rest a little bit, like if you're feeling fatigued. So there is some science here, and there's also an art to doing this progressive overload. I could do like a whole nother video on it, but again, I think you get the point. You've got to just train consistently over time, and that's because building a significant amount of muscle is a slow process, and it does take a lot of time, months and years. Okay, and then this leads into a point that's very important as well. Is you're not always going to feel like going to the gym to work out. I know I don't. There's days where I drive to the gym and I sit in the parking lot and play around on my phone and I'm like, God, I need to get my butt in there. I mean, half the battle is just having the motivation to go to the gym, whether it's your home gym down in the basement, whether it's a club that you go to, a private studio, you're an athlete training in a sports performance facility. Wherever it is, you just get there, okay? So your dedication has to be greater than your motivation, because like I said, you're not always going to feel motivated to train, but you just know it's something you've got to do, and if you don't stay dedicated, then you're not going to stay consistent. I mean, how can you train consistently if you're not dedicated, right? So just understand that you won't always feel like going there, okay? All right, so let's shift gears now here to nutrition. Obviously, this plays a major role. Proper nutrition is essential for maximizing muscle growth in addition to the resistance training you're doing. So let's first talk about energy balance. So this is your whole calories in versus calories out, right? If you're expending more calories than what you consume, you lose weight. If you consume more calories than what you expend, then you gain weight. And if the calories that you're consuming equal the calories that you're expending, you would be in an energy balance there where you would be maintaining weight. But in order to really maximize muscle growth, you want to put the body in an anabolic state. You want to consume more calories than what you expend, okay? So you got to eat, all right? So a positive energy balance, again, that's when you're consuming more calories than what you burn or expend, is necessary for maximizing muscle growth in response to resistance training. And there's some differences here on the amount of calories that you should consume above your maintenance level of calories that you would need to maintain weight, depending on if you're untrained, haven't been doing resistance training, or you're well-trained, have been doing training for at least, I'd say somebody that's well-trained has been training consistently for at least a year, okay, in the weight room. So untrained individuals, they can benefit from lots of extra energy, a substantial energy surplus of up to approximately 2,000 extra calories per day. So let's say that you've determined that the number of calories you need to eat to maintain weight each day is 2,500 calories, okay? There's online calculators to determine this. You could have it estimated in an exercise phys lab, directly measured actually, but typically you can use online calculators and equations to get a rough estimate of how many calories you would need to consume in a day just to maintain your body weight. So let's say you determine yours is 2,500 calories a day. That's how many you need to eat just to maintain weight. You could easily eat up to, 4,500 extra, or 4,500 calories total per day, 2,000 extra calories above that maintenance level. And you can eat that many more extra calories a day if you're untrained, because when you start lifting weights and you're applying this new stimulus to the body's going to say, wow, I need to use all these extra calories, the protein, the carbs, all these different macronutrients that you're taking in to help the body build muscle tissue, okay? Because again, this is a new stimulus to the body, this resistance training. And because untrained individuals have a higher hypertrophic potential, meaning a greater ability to lay down muscle mass because it's early on, they're just starting out training, they can utilize a lot of these extra calories and they get partitioned towards building muscle instead of being stored as fat. At least not as many of the calories are going to go towards fat storage, because the body's saying, wow, this is a new stimulus, lifting weights, we really need to build up some muscle. So many of those extra calories are going to get partitioned over to the muscle protein synthesis and building that muscle tissue. So they have a greater potential for growth and a faster rate of growth than, say, somebody that's been training for 5-10 years consistently, right? They're not going to build as much tissue, that well-trained individual, if they've been training for many, many years. And so as a result, well-trained individuals don't need to have as large of a positive energy balance to maximize muscle growth. So you see there with well-trained individuals, a positive energy balance of an extra 500 to 1,000 calories per day is preferable, meaning an extra 500 to 1,000 calories above what your calculated or estimated maintenance calorie intake would be each day to maintain weight. So just taking in, 500, 1,000 calories, that's it for well-trained individuals. Maybe even smaller surpluses of 200 to 300 calories per day for well-trained individuals if you're looking to minimize how many calories would get converted to fat or stored as fat. Okay, so let's say you're a bodybuilder, fitness competitor, and you're really trying to keep that body fat level down. Yeah, only increase that caloric intake by 200 to 300 calories above your maintenance level of calories per day. So again, if your maintenance was 2,500, you jump up your calorie intake to 2,700 to 2,800 calories per day. And again, that extra calorie surplus is going to help to optimize your muscle growth without maybe having the worry of some of the extra calories that you're taking in being stored as fat. So let's look at macronutrient recommendations now. So this table, and when I say macronutrients, that's referring to protein, carbohydrate, and fat that you consume in the diet. Those are your macronutrients, all right? So what are the recommendations for maximizing muscle hypertrophy and growth? So with protein, this is what you should aim for. Total daily protein intake is a critical factor. So you should be in the range of consuming 1.6 to 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. Okay, that's your range that you want to be in. If you eat less than that, your muscle growth is going to be suboptimal. So try to get that in that range for your protein. And think about what good protein sources are. Eggs, meat, fish. Those are all great protein sources. Animal products are going to be complete proteins, have all the essential amino acids in them. Milk. Carbohydrate, that's your next macronutrient. So you should be eating greater than or equal to 3 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight per day. If you're putting in really intense, longer training sessions and maybe also adding in cardio on top of it, you might aim for, a little bit higher, 4, 5, 6 grams per day. But again, that's your general recommendation for carbs. And then dietary fat, you want to shoot for And think about what good carbohydrate sources are, potatoes, whole grain rice and bread. Those are examples of good carbohydrate sources. Dietary fat, you're aiming for greater than or equal to 1 gram of fat per kilogram of body weight per day, and greater than or equal to 1.6 and 1.1 grams per day of omega-3 fatty acids for men and women respectively. So that's your goal for those omega-3s. And you can get omega-3s in, like salmon. Fatty fish is a great source, okay? Sardines. So definitely want to shoot to get those omega-3s in. Think about your fat intake is important because fat is going to help support, especially cholesterol that's in certain fatty foods. Cholesterol gets demonized, but it does play a role physiologically in your body. If you're not taking in enough fat, it can affect your ability to synthesize certain hormones. And some of these are anabolic hormones like testosterone, for instance. So you want to make sure and hit those levels as well so you can synthesize all the hormones that you need each day. All right, so with protein intake here, some of you may ask, well, how much protein should I consume per meal? Because remember, the total daily protein intake goal is between 1.6 to 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. If you can aim for consuming 0.4 to 0.55 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per meal, that's a good target, right? So shoot for that 0.4 to 0.55 grams per kilogram per meal and spread that across at least 4 meals throughout the day. So 4, 5, 6 meals, somewhere in there. And when I say meal, of course, breakfast, lunch, and dinner are your big meals, but then you're having some healthy, high-protein snacks in between, like mid-morning, maybe mid-afternoon, maybe before you go to bed. Then you have a total of 6 meals there in a day. So how would you calculate this? Remember, if you want to find your weight in kilograms, it's important to know 1 kilogram equals 2.2 pounds. So if I use myself as an example, if I want to convert my body weight in pounds to kilograms, I would take my body weight in pounds, which is 175, divide by 2.2, so I weigh 79.55 kilograms. And then I would want to multiply that kilogram value, 79.55 kilograms, by 0.4, okay? And that's on the low end, that 0.4 of that range for how many grams of protein I should be taking in per kilogram of body weight per meal. So I'm estimating on the low end. But 79.55 times 0.4, that gives me my recommendation of I should consume 31.82 grams of protein per meal, okay? And by consuming at least that amount per meal and spreading that across at least 4 meals per day, that's going to get me hopefully close to that target goal, my total daily protein intake value, okay? So nutrient timing, this used to be a big deal. I remember back in the early 2000s when I was working on my bachelor's degree in exercise science and even my master's and before my Ph.D., but like early 2000s, mid 2000s, nutrient timing was a big deal, talked about a lot. You need to eat a certain amount of protein or carbs as soon as possible after a workout or before a workout. And, there was all this stuff out there about when it was best to consume protein and carbs, these different macronutrients. So it does appear beneficial to consume, again, that 0.4 to 0.55 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, both prior to and after resistance training exercise, within about 4 to 6 hours of each other. Definitely if you're in a fasted state. So some of you may be doing like intermittent fasting where, maybe you only eat within an 8-hour time frame, okay? Say from like noon to 8 p.m. and then you fast, you don't eat anything the other 16 hours out of the day, right? So in fasted states, it is important to quickly consume protein as rapidly as possible after a workout Because during a workout, there's going to be some muscle protein degradation and breakdown, and then really to help stimulate muscle protein synthesis after that resistance training session and switch to where you have more muscle protein synthesis than muscle protein breakdown, it's really important that you consume some protein as quickly as possible if you haven't been eating and you've been fasting after that resistance training session. So that's important. Now, nutrient timing, this window of when you should eat, it's not as critical as just meeting your total daily protein requirement, okay? So don't feel bad if, maybe you eat breakfast, you eat a good healthy breakfast, then you don't have any lunch, and maybe you train at 2 or 3 in the afternoon. So it's been a while since you've eaten, but as long as at the rest of the day, maybe you have a big high protein dinner, get more protein in at night as a snack before bed. So maybe you haven't consumed 4, 5, or 6 meals that day, but as long as you can meet your total daily protein requirement, that's the main thing, okay? So if you're eating less frequently, less meals per day, you're just going to need to consume more protein at each meal. Okay, so the total daily protein intake is the biggest thing. For me, if we look at my body weight again, 79.55 kilograms is how much I weigh. I need to multiply that by, what my target is, being in that range for total daily protein intake, 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. So right there you see 174.9 grams of protein per day. That should be my target based on my weight. And basically, we round that 174.9 to 175. That's my weight in pounds. 175 grams of protein per day basically equates to 1 gram of protein per pound of my body weight. Okay, that's a good goal. That's what I should be targeting each day if I'm wanting to optimize and maximize muscle hypertrophy. Supplements. I've got a few slides here about supplements to consume. Remember that consuming your carbs, your protein, your fat through nutritious whole foods is most important to do in addition to your training. But then supplements can kind of fill in the gaps, right? Okay, and so I don't recommend a lot of supplements, but there are several that are going to help you with maximizing muscle growth. So creatine monohydrate, I've done a video on this about how this works in the body, but typically what's recommended is for you to consume 5 grams per day of creatine. Now, if you're very muscular, I'm talking like an NFL linebacker muscular, like 245, 250, rock solid. If you weigh above 220 pounds and you're really muscular, you could bump that up to consuming 10 grams per day. After you consume, this 5 or 10 grams per day, after about 28 days of consuming that amount of creatine, your muscle cells will get saturated with creatine. It actually gets stored, most of it as creatine phosphate in your muscle cells. And what that creatine phosphate does is, I'm skipping to the second arrow down there, it helps increase the rate of ATP regeneration. So that creatine phosphate, it'll donate a phosphate group, and you'll help regenerate ATP, adenosine triphosphate, from a molecule called adenosine diphosphate. And by increasing the rate at which you reform ATP, this is like pumping more gasoline into your cells. ATP is the fuel for muscle contraction and relaxation. So creatine can help increase the rate at which you form ATP during short-term, high-intensity exercise like resistance training or like running sprints. And by having more ATP, more fuel for those muscle cells to contract and relax, that can help reduce fatigue during intense, repeated bouts of exercise like resistance training, and it can allow you to perform more work during each training session. Also, creatine monohydrate helps to promote gains in strength and lean muscle mass. Because you have more ATP available in your muscle cells, you're going to be able to crank out more reps, more sets, probably do more work or more volume in your resistance training session, and that's going to lead to greater increases in strength and muscle mass. It also, in some studies, has shown to promote greater secretion of the intramuscular form of IGF-1, which again is an anabolic hormone. It increases muscle fiber protein content, and looks like it increases several myogenic regulatory factors. These are proteins that activate gene expression in muscle. And another thing creatine does, I often hear people at the gym say, oh, creatine makes you retain water. Not outside the cells, it doesn't. It actually helps pull. It has an osmotic effect. So creatine gets stored as creatine phosphate primarily in your muscle cells, and then that creatine phosphate draws in water to the cell. That's going to help volumize the cell, make it appear larger. And muscle is about 70% water anyway, about 20% protein. So having more water, a more hydrated muscle cell, is actually a very good thing. And the more hydrated a muscle cell is, the easier it's going to be for that muscle cell to synthesize new proteins and incorporate those into the muscle so that the muscle grows larger. So a hydrated muscle cell is a good thing. Creatine will draw water into the muscle, which that's good. It's not going to dehydrate you, so don't worry about that. And stick with the monohydrate form. There's various forms of creatine on the market now, but the monohydrate form has the most research behind it. It's safe, it's effective, it works. It's old school, so just stick with that form. All right, whey protein. This is the next supplement that I recommend to consume, especially if you're just not meeting that total daily protein requirement, your protein goal each day from whole foods. Like, you maybe you missed a meal, you didn't eat enough protein sources from food, then you can fill in the gap here with whey protein. So whey protein is derived from milk protein. Milk protein is about 80% casein and 20% whey. The great thing about whey protein is that when you consume it, it's rapidly digested and absorbed. So there's excellent bioavailability here. You drink your protein shake, the amino acids from that protein get absorbed from the small intestine into the bloodstream very quickly. I mean, you're talking, if you're on an empty stomach, they start getting into the bloodstream within 30 minutes to an hour. And then those amino acids are going to be circulating around in the blood and get uptaken by your muscle cells. And eventually, the ribosomes will link those amino acids together and you'll start forming protein in your muscles, okay? So it helps to rapidly increase muscle protein synthesis, lean muscle mass, and strength. Whey protein contains lots of essential amino acids. There are 9 essential amino acids, meaning you have to get them from the diet. The body does not synthesize them. Okay, there's 11 non-essential the body can make. 9 are essential that you have to get from the diet. Whey protein has all the essential amino acids in it, including a very important one, which is leucine. Leucine is an amino acid that is important for switching on intramuscular signaling pathways and activating those pathways in the molecule mTOR, like you see there in that little diagram. And when that mTOR is switched on inside your muscle cells, that's going to direct the cell to increase muscle protein synthesis. Increase muscle protein synthesis, incorporate more proteins into the muscle, your muscle fiber grows larger. Okay, so whey protein and that amino acid leucine can help trigger that pathway that leads to those ribosomes in the cell building more proteins. Okay, so rest, recovery, and sleep. Okay, this is often overlooked. Remember that when you're working out, you're doing an upper body workout, some lat pull downs, some bench presses, shoulder presses, bicep curls, all this. Yeah, your muscle cells will feel like they're larger during the workout. That's just because when they're contracting, you have blood going to those muscles, and they feel larger just because of the increased blood flow to the muscles during the workout. But they actually grow not during the workout itself, but during your rest periods between workouts, okay? So that's when that muscle protein synthesis is going to be increased and you're going to be building muscle tissue, all right, is during those rest periods. So adequate sleep and rest days are vital for muscle recovery and growth. You should shoot for or aim for at least 7 to 9 hours of sleep per night. Allow at least 48 to 72 hours of rest between resistance training bouts before training the same muscle group again. So if you trained legs on Monday, you wouldn't want to train those leg muscles again until at least, 48 hours later. So if you train at 9 a.m. Monday morning, you don't want to wait till at least Wednesday, 9 a.m., that's 48 hours, or Thursday at 9 a.m. to train those same muscle groups again, okay? And that's just going to ensure adequate muscle repair, recovery, and adaptation. Age. So muscle mass, let's say you start training in high school, your freshman year, and you train consistently through your teenage years, your 20s, into your 30s, somewhere between your age 20 and 40, muscle mass tends to reach peak levels during those years. After age 40, the body loses progressively more muscle mass per year. Now, regular resistance training, as long as you keep doing it into your 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, throughout your entire life, it's going to attenuate or blunt the loss of muscle mass that normally occurs after age 40. Okay, so it's very important, again, to keep training consistently throughout your life, okay, so that you can, you prevent the accelerated loss of muscle mass that occurs with aging. Now, the hypertrophic potential, so your ability to stimulate muscle growth diminishes with advancing age due to reductions in anabolic hormones, like some of the ones I mentioned, like testosterone and IGF-1. Satellite cell function, satellite cells just aren't working as well, and increased chronic low-grade inflammation throughout the body. Now, the elderly, those in their 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s, can still gain muscle, though they may need a greater weekly training dose once they have achieved a given level of hypertrophy. So I always tell older adults, if you're in your 70s, 80s, 90s, you can still gain muscle and you can still get stronger. You're just not going to lay down muscle tissue and build it at the same rate as, say, somebody that's 21. And if you just started training, say, in your 70s, 80s, 90s, have never trained before, you're not going to build as much muscle tissue, obviously, as somebody that was younger and had been training from the time they were, say, a teenager all throughout their life, okay? This graph shows on the y-axis percentage of muscle loss. Across the x-axis, the horizontal axis, you see age. So at 25, 35, and on all the way out to 89. The green columns or green bars represent just a normal individual that's, eating a normal diet, but they're not engaging in any resistance training. How is their muscle mass going to change with age? Then you look at the blue bar, that's someone that is eating a healthy, normal diet, but they're also doing resistance training across their whole lifespan. And then the purple is someone that is not taking in enough protein across the lifespan, and then red is somebody with diabetes, so someone that, disease state, not overall healthy, okay? So let's look at 25, everyone's pretty equal there at age 25. Age 35, there's about a 5% loss there in muscle mass, maybe not even really apparent yet. Then you look in 40s, and honestly, I'm not sure on this graph why it looks about the same or is up above that 5% value there. But then you get into the 50s, because typically it's in the 40s you start to see some muscle mass loss. But you get into the 50s, you start to see some changes, it dropping down for all groups. It drops down at 60, 69. I mean, you see for all groups that there's a loss of muscle mass with age. Now, the interesting thing is look at the blue bar. That's the individuals that are doing resistance training across all these different age categories, okay? So that blue bar is elevated above the others at every age, at 52, at 60, at 69, at 77, meaning that the rate of loss of muscle mass in those that are doing resistance training over the course of their life is less, right? They're not losing as much muscle. They're able to maintain it throughout their lifetime, okay, because of the resistance training they're doing. So we'll also talk about sex here. So the ability to build muscle differs between the sexes. Women attain approximately equal relative muscle growth compared to men following regular resistance training. However, men tend to gain significantly more muscle on an absolute basis. And part of this is probably due to men having 10 to 20 times higher levels of testosterone circulating in the bloodstream than women do. Okay, so just greater, larger amounts of anabolic hormone circulating there could be a potential factor in the reason why males tend to develop, on an absolute basis, more muscle mass than females. Definitely in the upper body. Women tend to experience a greater age-related muscle loss than men also, and so this is especially true in postmenopausal women. So most women are going to hit menopause, around 45 to 50, 52 years of age, somewhere in there. And there's going to be a drop, significant reduction in estrogen levels in the body after menopause. And that drop in estrogen, there is an age-related loss in muscle mass associated with that, and then also a loss of bone mineral density and bone mass. So this is where it's very important for women as you get into the 40s, the 50s, and after menopause to go ahead and do some resistance training, some strength training, so that you can help preserve your muscle tissue and also your bone density. That's going to help reduce your risk of osteoporosis and fractures as you move into your 70s, 80s, and 90s. And then just maintaining some muscle mass, that's going to allow you to live independently for longer as you move into those older years, right? So if you want to remain independent, you need to stay strong. And to stay strong, you've got to have some muscle mass, right? You need that muscle and that strength to get up and down your steps, to do your activities of daily living, laundry, lift groceries, all of that as you age. So I'm tying in sex back with age here, but it's very important. A lot of people just think of muscle mass as, it's some meathead at the gym or bodybuilder, but muscle mass is it's critical as you age, that you have muscle mass and you have enough muscle mass to support the strength to get through the day independently on your own. All right, so training status. This is a big factor in how much muscle that you can grow. An untrained individual, call them a newbie, somebody that's new to the gym, versus a trained individual. So muscle growth is definitely much more rapid in a newbie, someone that's untrained and has never done resistance training. And it's going to be much slower, the ability to grow muscle and build muscle, in somebody that's been training, say, for 10 years, a decade straight, okay? So the hypertrophic capacity diminishes as people become more resistance trained, right? And that's just due to this ceiling effect. So it becomes more difficult to increase muscle size after years of training, like say you've been training for a decade, because you're moving closer to one's like genetic limit or genetic ceiling. Versus you take somebody that's never resistance trained before, maybe they're starting out as an 8th grader, freshman in high school. Man, they've got a lot of potential for muscle growth, right? They're not anywhere close to that genetic ceiling, right? So alterations in anabolic signaling impair the ability to accrete muscle proteins with consistent participation in a resistance training program. The ability to increase muscle mass is always present. No matter how much training that you've done, it's just the gains are going to be really small and tiny the more years of training you've put in, versus it's much more apparent if a newbie starts out day one and then you look at them a year later, they may look like a whole new person. It's important to manipulate resistance training program variables, the volume, right? That's your total number of sets and reps. The intensity, that's the load, the amount of weight you're using, as people approach their genetic ceiling. So there needs to be a little bit more nuance to your training program as you become more well-trained, okay? So now let's look at, some interesting points here about, how much muscle can you build in a day? How much muscle can you build in a year? So we're going to go through some of this here. So under ideal optimal conditions considering all the factors that play a role in muscle growth. So this is ideal, like perfect conditions. So you've got great genetics, you've got a properly designed resistance training program that you're consistently following, right? You're progressively overloading. Your nutrition's on point. You're meeting your total daily protein intake. You're taking in the right supplements like creatine to help you out. You're recovering. You're allowing enough rest period, 48 to 72 hours before training the same muscle group again. And then training status. You know, if you're a newbie, you're going to have a much greater potential to build muscle than somebody that's well trained. So again, thinking about all those factors, you know, how much muscle could you build in one day? Well, Dr. Michael Colgan, who is a very well-respected sport nutritionist at the Colgan Institute of Nutritional Sciences, he states that, quote, because of the limiting rate of turnover in the muscle cells, it is impossible to grow more than an ounce of new muscle each day. And so what is an ounce? That's like 28.35 grams, something like that. So it's really, in his opinion, in his statement here, it's impossible to grow more than that 1 ounce of new muscle each day. So this is an estimation for natural lifters, not individuals using anabolic steroids. And basically everything I've talked about here today is in reference to natural lifters, because obviously if you're taking exogenous anabolic steroids, the rates of protein synthesis are increased, and people that are using anabolic steroids, yes, they can build more muscle mass, okay? And this, how much muscle can be built in a day and in a year and over a lifetime, it's a very difficult topic to research accurately. So difficult to get, you know, a precise measure on this, but let's just use Dr. Colgan's estimation of being able to grow up to 1 ounce of muscle per day under optimal conditions. So we'll do some math here. Let's say you take an untrained or newbie lifter, 1 ounce of new muscle built per day. Again, that's kind of your cap there, based on Dr. Colgan's estimation, and you multiply that by the number of days in a year, 365, you get 365 ounces of muscle tissue that could, in a perfect world, be built in a year, okay? Remember that 1 pound equals 16 ounces, so if you take 365 ounces of muscle and divide by 16 ounces, which equals a pound, you could theoretically, if everything's going perfect, which it very rarely is, right? Theoretically, you could build 22.81, we'll just say 23 pounds of muscle in a year, all right? Okay? Reasonable estimate there. So we'll go to the next slide. So how much muscle can you build beyond 1 year? So maybe around year one, as I mentioned, these are average estimates. So these are means, right? Average estimate rates for muscle gain in males, right? Now, some males may gain a little more each year, some males a little less. These are averages. Some people are going to say, well, I didn't gain that much, or I gained more. Again, these are averages, okay? So in this chart here, I have the first column. That's years of proper training, you know, diet, recovery, genetics, all those things considered. And you have year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4 of training. The second column is how much can you expect? How many pounds of muscle per month each year? So in 1 month, how much can you expect to gain? And then across in an entire year, that third column, okay? So year 1, you're looking at maybe gaining 1.5 to 2 pounds of muscle tissue per month. And again, this is year 1 of somebody this is their first year of training, right? Literally their first year of resistance training. And in that first year, your hypertrophic capacity is going to be pretty large. So you may be able to gain anywhere from 20 to 25 pounds. And we did the math on the previous slide. I said about, what, 22.81, 23 pounds based off Dr. Colgan's statement about you can only really build an ounce a day. So we're right around this range here, 20 to 25 pounds in that first year if you train consistently, right? Not going to go in and train once a week or once every 2 weeks and expect to lay down 20 to 25 pounds of muscle tissue. But again, training consistently each week of that first year. Year 2, you're looking at the monthly gain. You see it drops down a bit. You're not going to gain as much muscle at as fast of a rate because now you've done a year of training. You're into year 2, so you're more well-trained. Your hypertrophic, your muscle growth capacity is going to go down as these years of training proceed forward. Okay, so 1 pound a month. You're looking at that second year, maybe gaining 10 to 12 pounds of muscle tissue. And then year 3, now you're moving into your 3rd consecutive year of resistance training. So again, that muscle growth capacity is going to drop down a bit because each year that goes by, you're getting closer to that theoretical genetic ceiling. So year 3, you're looking at a monthly gain of about half a pound on average and a yearly gain of 5 to 6 pounds. Then you move into year 4. The monthly gains are going to be very small, tiny, hard to measure, and you're looking at maybe gaining 2 to 3 pounds in that 4th year. So again, these are average estimates, right? Just remember that. There's going to be outliers. Some people gain more, some males in this case, more muscle mass, some will gain less each year. Now let's look at females, okay? So average estimates for rates of muscle gain in females beyond 1 year, okay? So yeah, that first year, monthly gain of about 3/4 of a pound up to 1 pound per month. And again, you see the hypertrophic potential isn't quite as high on an absolute basis in females. So a female that's training solidly, consistently for a year, you're looking at 10 to 12 pounds of muscle gain. That's feasible, that's reasonable. Year 2, a similar thing that you see with males. Again, as these years proceed, the amount of muscle that you can gain per month and per year is going to decline. It's going to be reduced because you're getting closer to that theoretical genetic limit. So year 2, you're looking at about a half a pound per month, 5 to 6 pounds of muscle tissue gained over that second year. Year 3, about 1/4 of a pound per month, and then 2.5 to 3 pounds per year. And then year 4, again, the monthly gain is going to be small, tiny, just as what you saw in the males. And you're looking at maybe 1.25 to 1.5 pounds of muscle built over that 4th year. Okay, so again, these are averages. Get it? There's going to be outliers. There's going to be some females that gain more, some less. So how much muscle can you build over a lifetime? All right, so training consistently, you start at a young age, maybe middle school, high school, and you train over your entire life. Average man or woman can expect to max out their muscle gains after 5 to 10 years of consistent, smart, progressive overload resistance training. And again, an adequate nutritional support, an optimal diet that supports muscle growth, and again, good overall health. Okay, so a lot of factors here at play, but typically after 5 to 10 years of good hard training, diet, and you're overall healthy, you haven't had a lot of injuries, you're typically going to max out your muscle gains after that time frame, and then it's just about maintaining it, right? Males, if you start resistance training at a young age, your teens, 20s, or 30s, you use appropriate loads and volumes, you train close to failure each set, and you eat in a way that supports muscle growth, you can expect to gain 35 to 50 pounds of muscle over your lifetime naturally. Of course, if you're using performance-enhancing drugs, anabolic steroids, that number would likely be higher, okay? Females, if you start resistance training at a young age, again, your teens, 20s, or 30s, somewhere in there, and you use appropriate loads, volumes, you train close to failure, you eat in a caloric surplus that helps to support muscle growth, obviously not too much to where you're also going to accumulate a lot of fat, but a surplus, you can expect to gain 18 to 25 pounds of muscle over your lifetime naturally. Again, these are averages. Some males and females may gain more than the pounds I've indicated here, and some individuals may gain less. So, long episode, that's all I have for today. Again, Dr. Taylor. If you have questions about the KU Exercise Science program, email me at jtaylor@ku.edu, or you can call my office phone, 913-897-8516. Thanks again for watching another episode of Fitness Facts.